Everybody, it is my honor to do a little land acknowledgement before we all get started with the program. Our workshop series is called Beyond Land Acknowledgement for a reason. Recently, it has become customary to preface public meetings with a respectful nod to all the First Nations and Indigenous peoples who travelled upon or resided on these lands that we now occupy and profess to own. In some cases, this land acknowledgement has become repetitious and little more than lip service. In my opinion, a true land acknowledgement must be more than a litany of nations who have lived on the land before us. How would it be if we, settlers, were to change our worldview to bring it in line with the Indigenous one? What if we learned a new relationship with the land, one that respects the rights and interrelationship of all living things, respects their diversity and fragility, recognizes that no one owns the land, we must share it and care for it, embracing its beauty and resilience as it nourishes us in return. It is in this spirit that the treaties were made. Let us all try harder to live up to them.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Sara, and I am one of a Westwood reconciliation group hosting you this afternoon. And we bid you all a Westwood welcome. This will be a hybrid gathering with viewers in person, such as yourselves, and viewers online. And the session is being recorded and will be on YouTube in a few days. So a few housekeeping notes for anyone who's recently come to the building or are new. There are sweets and drinks at the back, and please take them as you like. Refresh yourselves whenever it suits you, and if nature calls, there's an accessible bathroom on this floor, and there are also, through this exit here and down the stairs, are two other gender-free washrooms. We're going to have questions, but they're going to be following our speaker's presentation. So the speaker series, Beyond Land Acknowledgements, began with a curiosity about the land Westwood occupies and its unknown history, Indigenous history to us. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Miranda Jimmy. Miranda is a resident of Edmonton, and her home is Treaty 6 Cree Nation Thunderchild. Miranda has been an Indigenous educator for Westwood and a dear friend to me. I know her as passionately dedicated to the truth of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action, sharing her lived experience of our colonizing and racist systems that prevail today in Canada. Miranda has shed light on the dark legacy of Charles Camsell Hospital and its indelible impact on patients and their families. She works as an independent consultant, tackling issues with unions and universities, governments at all levels, not-for-profits, local, provincial, and national. She's in demand as a keynote speaker, sharing her wisdom and expertise to a wide body of organizations across Canada. And one of the things I like about her is her creative endeavors, curating exhibits, mentoring emerging arts collectives, co-creating Rise in Solidarity Edmonton, and currently she is in the midst of producing a podcast series. One of Miranda's secret powers is that she comes to us non-Indigenous folk accomplished, informed, and armed from her dense and deep Indigenous networks, themselves agents for change on their lands and in their communities. And I, for one, can't hear what she has to say to us this afternoon. And Miranda, thank you for your willingness to come once again in Westwood's best interests.
Danse, oki, bonjour, hello. My name is Andrea Menard, and I am the lead educational developer for indigenizing curricula and pedagogies, cross-appointed with the Vice Provost's Office for Indigenous Programming and Research and the Centre for Teaching and Learning at the University of Alberta. I am a guest on the west part of Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwich-Waskagan, in the homeland of the Papaschase or Papasteo Nation. The Papaschase Nation was established as part of Treaty 6 in 1877, but Canada annulled it 11 years later in 1888. They were pushed off the fertile land and were made to move further south in Edmonton, and were expelled from that land base as well, because Chief Papasteo caught the government cheating on their land-based allotment for them. They were left landless and are still landless today. I am also on ancestral Blackfoot land, as well as the Métis homeland region, where North Campus sits. There used to be Métis river lots here. The Garneau district is named after the Garneau Métis family. They were pushed off the land where we teach, learn, and decide on important matters, and were made to move to St. Paul de Métis, or St. Paul, Alberta, as it's now known. They were later expelled from St. Paul de Métis after a couple of years due to French settlers moving in, and were made to move to their winter camps that became the Métis settlements of Alberta. I acknowledge and understand that until Indigenous peoples living in these territories and across Turtle Island regain our sovereignty and self-government, and that until restitution is paid and truth is unambiguously communicated, that we are all participating in and benefiting from colonial violence.
My friend Andrea Menard, who calls herself a Métis anti and anti-colonial scholar. What you just witnessed is actually an AI production. The University of Alberta's AI department took her image and her words and created that video. I just wanted to share that because obviously the land that she's talking about, North Campus, is not far from here, and that history is important, but also the idea that Indigenous people can evolve and adapt with technology, and we exist today as well. Tanse, Miranda Jimmy Nasigasu, Namisquichi Waskai Kanochi, Upchis Nehi Hawan. Hello, friends. My name is Miranda Jimmy. I'm in the process of regaining my Cree language, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to speak a little bit of it to you here today. I am a Treaty Indian, according to the Government of Canada. I'm a direct descendant of First Nations people who signed treaty with the Crown and whose name appears on the Indian registry maintained by the Government of Canada. I'm a Nehiyaw Esqueu, a proud member of Thunderchild First Nation, which signed the adhesion to Treaty 6 in 1879. My father, my late paternal grandmother, my late paternal great-grandparents, all too are Treaty Indians. Like my ancestors before me, as a member of Thunderchild First Nation, I have a certificate of Indian status, known as a status card. My mother is a person of mixed European and First Nations ancestry, including Dutch, British, and Lakota. She is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. My late great-great-grandmother, through my paternal grandfather, is the Lakota ancestor of which my mother gained her tribal enrollment. Because the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation was also established in 1851 and 1868 through the Fort Laramie Treaty and the Sioux Act of 1889, I am a treaty Indian through my maternal lineage as well. The blood of my ancestors from both sides of the 49th parallel run through my veins. I am a descendant of First Nations people who signed treaty with the Crown, and of which has come certain rights and much hardship. Through their experiences, their resilience, their culture, I am who I am, and it's foundational to who I am and how I walk through this world. I'm an intergenerational survivor of the Indian residential school system and the Native American boarding school system. I'm committed to knowing the truth about the past that influences the present day. To honor this truth, I had to first know what the truth was of who I am and the trauma that has impacted every branch of my family tree. This history was not taught to me in my upbringing, and in many ways is still not fully acknowledged today. Fighting to know and share the truth is my mission. For more than 20 years now, my paid professional work has centered around uncovering and amplifying this truth. Listening to the stories of my elders, learning from their experiences, searching through archival records to validate these truths, and helping others to understand it all. This journey has also been incredibly important to me personally. It's allowed me to make sense of my childhood, begin the long process of undoing negative coping mechanisms, and aim to break cycles of abuse that have been passed down through generations. As Sara alluded to, I call myself a cultural translator. Much of my work has been working for mainstream colonial organizations and institutions who want to provide programs and services to Indigenous people and serving as that bridge to the communities they intend to serve. Part of that is also a responsibility to those communities, both Indigenous and otherwise marginalized communities, to advocate on behalf of those communities to change those programs and services to better meet those needs. This work is difficult, it's challenging, it's emotionally draining, it's mentally abusive at some times, but the reason I keep going is because the truth is important to me. My work in this area started before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I worked for a program that was funded by Indian Residential Schools Resolution Canada, which was the ministry created to negotiate the settlement agreement out of court with survivors of residential school. Before there was a TRC process, I was collecting and bearing witness to the stories from survivors. Through sitting and documenting those stories, I started to understand my own experience in a very different way. That's led to my mission of truth, both for my own personal healing and my own understanding of who I am, but also making sure that all Canadians know that truth that has been denied to us. As Sara mentioned, this work has also led to uncovering the truth of other systemic institutions that perpetuated assimilation and colonization, including the Indian hospital system. Here in Edmonton, we had one of the largest Indian hospitals, the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, which stands today in the neighborhood of Inglewood. And for the last 10 years, I've been supporting former patients as well as family members to uncover the truth of their experiences there. That's meant locating records related to their health experience and treatment. It has meant locating and marking grave sites, and it has been work across borders, across Canada, to help people find healing and search for the truth. This work of reconciliation is personal to me. It means understanding my own way of walking through these two worlds, challenging the ways I've been taught and the truth of colonization and how it's impacted my life, and making conscious efforts every day to navigate that and change it in my own actions and words. As I do that, as I journey along this as a personal journey, I work hard to translate that into my practice, in my paid profession, as well as into my relationships. I feel a responsibility to teach because others have taught me. And I think about the opportunity that I have when I have a microphone like this to help others along that journey which also comes with your responsibility to teach what you've been learning. So you may think that you know only a little bit of this story, but you have a responsibility to pass that on to someone who knows none of it. So I ask you to open your hearts and minds today to approach this conversation with the responsibility of what are you going to do with the information you gain today. One of the biggest challenges I've experienced in this work is not knowing the truth about the Indian residential school system that directly affected my family. My dad was a student of a residential school, St. Anthony's Sacred Heart Residential School in Onion Lake, Saskatchewan. This was my story and was not taught to me. And so it makes me question what other parts of our colonial history have we been denied? What have we not been taught? And how has that been intentional that the truth has been hidden from us to perpetuate this narrative of who we are as Canadians? Ultimately, I think Canadians and Canada is known as this place where you can come and you can practice your religion, you can teach your traditions, you can share your language and your culture with your friends and your family and the community, and all of that's accepted. That's who we say we are as Canadians. Ultimately, that comes with an asterisk, except for the First Peoples that were here. And until we start living into that truth of who we are, then we can't say that that's who we are. So I challenge you to kind of challenge that narrative of who you think we are as Canadians, what you've been taught, and how much you still need to learn. Through all of this work, it's only possible because of the relationships that I've built. I think of time not as this linear fashion, but as this cyclical motion of loops. And individuals and information has come to me in full circle multiple times in my life. And those relationships and the people that have come along with me on this journey and been on this journey in their own ways are in many ways responsible for me being here. So I want to honor those relationships and say thank you to those who have gifted me with knowledge, shared their experience, and helped me on my journey to decolonizing. The reason I'm here today is because of some relationships that I've built. As Sara alluded to, she saw me speak several years ago and then raised her hand when I ran politically for city council several years ago. And her and I spent many hot summer days walking door to door, chatting with the residents of Edmonton. And in between those door knocking sessions, we had an opportunity to form a friendship and an understanding. As we got deeper in our conversations, I realized that Sara had a personal connection to the Indian hospital system and had a personal motivation for reconciliation in many ways in her personal life and in reflecting on her career. So what started as a volunteer opportunity led to a deep friendship of walking this path together to reconciliation. Because of my relationship with Sara, I was also introduced to Westwood congregation, and I've had the opportunity to speak with many of you before. Several years ago, I hosted a blanket exercise here, and over the last couple years, we've had Zoom conversations, so your face looks a little bit different in person than in the box on the screen, but I say thank you, and thank you for welcoming me back, and thank you for being a part of this journey with me. Because of that relationship with Sara and others in the congregation, that led to this speaker series that I'm grateful to be a part of. It also meant that I had an opportunity to influence Sara and the reconciliation group here on who else has knowledge to keep in bringing this conversation forward about this space that Westwood occupies on the land of Treaty 6. I want to acknowledge Dylan, who's here today, who was the first speaker in the series. Dylan and I met on our own journeys of reconciliation in different ways several years ago. I was working for the Edmonton Heritage Council, and he was producing a film for us. And in many conversations that we've had since then, I've seen him grow and his understanding of this work grow and deepen in many ways. And that's all I can hope for in the work that I do, is that others are inspired to continue their own journey, whatever that means for them. A couple months ago, the second speaker in the series, Harvey Young Chief, you had a chance to meet, or if you haven't, both of those presentations are on YouTube. Harvey and I first met, I'm not even sure how long ago, but it was in our work with collecting the stories of survivors of residential school. He was working as a support worker and then led to work with the Confederacy of Treaty 6 to locate the exact location where the adhesion was signed here within the city of Edmonton boundaries. So again, those loops and those circles keep returning, and I'm grateful that my circle keeps getting broadened because of every conversation and interaction that I have an opportunity to have. I want to honor both Dylan and Harvey for the knowledge that they've shared with you, and I want to reflect a little bit on what they shared with you. If you haven't had a chance or you didn't participate in those, I encourage you to watch the recordings. In rewatching them before I came here today, a few things stuck out to me. One thing that Dylan shared was this idea of stained glass windows, and each of us looking through our stained glass window to the world through our own lens and our own understanding. That is something that's really important, and something that I think of in the responsibility that I have in being often the one that's handed the microphone to speak on behalf of Indigenous folks here in our city. I can only speak from my experience, my lived experience, the knowledge I've gained on my journey, and I recognize that this is being recorded, and this is a snapshot in time of what I know where I am today. If you ask me the same questions tomorrow or a week from now or 10 years from now, you might get a different answer because I'm in a different place on my journey. So that piece of glass that we're looking through changes because of the people and the knowledge that we gain, what's happening in the world, how we're feeling that day, and how our lives have been impacted through the snapshots that we have. I want to refer to that piece of glass because each of you also have your own lens, and you're interpreting and taking in this information from the speaker series in different ways based on how you're feeling today. It's a little warm in here, it's a little smoky, maybe you're a little distracted, maybe you'll take something different from it if you come back in a month or two from now and rewatch this conversation. So I encourage you to keep doing that learning. Something else that also stuck out to me from the last two presentations was the hyper-focus on the last 200 years of history. So Dylan talked about the survey and homestead records that were about the division of land, either through assignment, purchase, through treaty, through government records, however the land was split up and divided, and the records that verify that. Harvey also talked about the signing of Treaty 6 and the creation of the reserve system. What I felt was missing was what was life like before 200 years ago? What was life like here, across the West, across the place known as Turtle Island? And so I want to take some time reflecting on that today. I also heard questions from the audience around history in relation to present-day landmarks and your own situation on this land. I thought those questions were interesting because it really underlined for me this foreignness that exists in how do we even talk about a place that we can't even imagine in our own eyes. What did this place look like before streets and buildings and, Dylan referred to the lake that existed here. If we can't even picture that in our mind, how do we know what the land looked like? So I want you to think about that, that life and land and relationships existed long before the arrival of settlers to this place. The other thing that I found interesting in re-listening to the conversations was the focus of telling the history in relationship to human settlement and colonial law rather than traditional territory. So thinking about this land not in relationship to how the government perceived it or what should happen here, but what are the relationships and the existence that happened here even before humans existed in this place. When we think about the land being divided and people being divided, that also has impact on other beings. What was the impact on the lake that was here, the watersheds that were reliant on that lake, the biodiversity that relied on that water source? All of those were impacted when the land and the people were divided as well. Often when we talk about truth, we use it in the singular sense, but I like to think about truth in the plural sense. The truth can be a perception from individuals' experience. I think about it in a Venn diagram, one circle being the official records. What do the written records say the truth is? Unfortunately, the official records are flawed. They're biased depending on who wrote them, who in that period of time has chosen to keep or discard particular records, and they're often incomplete. So there are official records that tell a truth, but it's not the truth. The other kind of truth that exists is living memory. Those who were there to bear witness and experience that happening. They have a story to tell based on what they understand the truth to be, based on their experience, what they remember from that experience, that may be different than what's captured in the official record. The challenge with living memory is that it dies when the person dies. It's also filtered through their experience and what they remember, and it can fade with time. The third part of the truth is the community knowledge. This is the knowledge that's shared and passed on through generations and accepted by the community as truth. These are the oral histories that are told, the stories that are told, and the experiences of that living memory that are passed on to loved ones. The challenge with community knowledge is that it's unverifiable. It can change depending on who's relaying the story. But ultimately, there is truth in that as well. If you think about those three pieces, the official records, the living memory, and the community knowledge in that Venn diagram, where they overlap in the middle, and all those three things come together, that's the truth. One of the other things I heard in the presentations that came, and even in my introduction to you today, is the reference to Beaver Hills House, Amiskwichiwaskahikan. This is the Cree name for Edmonton, but it is also colonial. This refers to the Fort Edmonton that existed here after contact as part of the fur trade. What was this place referred to before that? We know that this is the traditional territory of the Blackfoot, the Cree, the Dene, Nakota Sioux, Saulteaux, Métis people. What is their word for this place? That history has been lost and is not currently accepted or presented when we talk about this land. Something that really struck me in re-listening to Harvey's presentation was that of other sources of knowledge. He didn't have a PowerPoint to say, here are my references of where you need to go to learn more, but all of that was peppered in if you listen closely to what he said. He mentioned particular names of people who are known knowledge keepers and could answer some of the questions that were brought forward or are accepted in the community as being the ones who are responsible for sharing those stories. He also talked about the importance of creation stories and legends that are passed on. And without saying this, and oftentimes it goes unspoken, is as an Indigenous person, as a Cree woman walking this land, I feel open to answer any questions that come my way, but I can't always provide you the answer. Some of the answers need to be earned or learned in different ways than standing at a microphone asking a question. And so I challenge you to think about your own path of learning as well. Harvey also talked about other ways that you can access information besides inviting an Indigenous person to a microphone, like Treaty 6 Recognition Day that happens at City Hall every August. Those are opportunities to bear witness to community elders and knowledge keepers who are recognized by the community to share those stories in a public way. He also talked about the Peace Hills Treaty, and oftentimes we talk about Treaty 6, but there are other treaty relationships that exist on this land. Treaty 6 is about a relationship between the First Nations people and the Crown, but there were nation-to-nation treaties signed and agreed to long before contact and with the Crown. By the way, we talk about Treaty 6 often. How many of you in the room or online in Zoom have actually read Treaty 6? Handful, okay. But the written, again, we go back to the official record as one version of the story. How many of you have listened to the story told by a First Nations elder that's responsible for carrying that history from that perspective? A few. How many have sat in circle in community and listened to the community tell the story of Treaty 6? So there are different truths, and you're all going to get a little bit different version of the story depending on that. So if you think about your responsibility of being a treaty person, that comes with challenging that colonial narrative of what does Treaty 6 actually mean. Harvey also talked about the Frog Lake Resistance and how his family came to be at McEwan. My family also was part of the Frog Lake Resistance. Something I don't mention when I introduce myself, but is also a part of my history that I'm beginning to understand, is my paternal grandfather was the grandson of the Indian agent at Onion Lake, who was taken underground to Fort Pitt during the Frog Lake Resistance and protected because of the uprising that was happening. My grandmother and the grandson of the Indian agent, George Mann III, were in a relationship of sorts. Whether it was consensual or not, I'm not sure, because they're no longer with us. But as a result of their relationship, my father was born. So I have also on my paternal line that First Nations blood, but also the Indian agents that actually did this to me and my family also ingrained in me. So that blood memory exists in me whether I understand it or not, and it's something that when we talk about personal reconciliation, it flows through me in different ways. So what I've actually been asked to speak about today is, where do we go from here? We talk about this idea of acknowledging land, of understanding the land in which we situate ourselves. But the fact is, we exist in a capitalist urban environment where systems and processes and rules have been put in place that we abide by because either we've been taught to abide by them, we adhere to them because we want to be law-abiding citizens, or it's just all we know. And so how do we reconcile this idea of being treaty people when all of the systems we operate within don't honor that? That comes now a personal responsibility. What does that mean individually to be a treaty person, to recognize and honor the land in which you're situated on, if every system and circle you operate within doesn't honor it? When I think about land acknowledgement specifically, the series called Beyond Land Acknowledgements, as Cassie mentioned, these are kind of housekeeping things that we do, and we don't often think about them in our day-to-day. When you leave here today, you're going to probably jump in your car and go pick up groceries and go back home or whatever your daily errands are for a weekend afternoon. But what does it mean to be a treaty person and do all of those things in an urban environment? And that's really what getting down to acknowledging the land really means. Through colonization, we've all been taught to disconnect from the land, to use it for our own will, to access it when we need it and expect it to be there, and not think about our relationship to it and our responsibility and respect for it. Treaty land acknowledgements are a fairly recent thing. I'd say the past 5 or 10 years or so, they've become commonplace for most large community gatherings, especially when it's known Indigenous people are going to be there. In many cases, I've come to expect it and I notice it when it doesn't take place. But as Canadians, we've yet to acknowledge the treaty in our everyday lives. I still cringe when I see community leaders get up to a microphone and read an acknowledgement off a piece of paper without a grasp for what it is that they're saying and stumbling over the basic pronunciation of the nations they're supposed to be honoring. For me, acknowledging the land and treaty is not a matter of housekeeping. It is a reminder of our connection to each other and our personal responsibility to right relations. Although I don't know you and some of you might not know each other, we are here today in relationship. We are connected in various ways through the physical and virtual space we're sharing and our belief, or at least a basic curiosity, in reconciliation. More deeply, though, we are connected as beings. Each of us are connected with the world around us through our actions and interactions, and we know that those actions have impact on one another. I noticed when I came in today that the 7 principles of the Unitarians are printed on the wall, and the first one over here says respect all beings. But it also said the inherent worth and dignity of every person. What about our relatives that are not human beings? When we think about who is impacted by our decisions, we often think about other people. When we think about a growing need for inclusion, we consider those people who are different than us and have been marginalized by society and excluded. But what about the other beings who are also impacted by us? Our actions and our words influence all of our relatives, the four-legged, the winged, the finned, the flowing, and the rooted beings that make up our world. For all of those beings who surround us each day and every day, who give and receive life from the land, humans, the two-legged, were the last here to arrive, and we have disrupted the balance that existed. We have and continue to have detrimental impacts on the world because of our decisions. Acknowledging the land must start from this place of truth and the negative consequences our decisions continue to have on our relatives. Every day, the land and the beings who are sustained by it are responsible for sustaining our lives. We are here today because of the land, and we have a responsibility to respect the land and honor it in all that we do. This may seem like a disconnected, maybe philosophical way to think about the world and our connection to it, so I want to do a little exercise with you to think about it more concretely. So I want you to sit back in your chair. Plant your feet firmly on the ground, uncross your legs. Those of you at home, please join along as well. Place your hands on your knees or folded in your lap. If you're comfortable, you can close your eyes. Take a deep breath and sit in silence for a moment. Think about your 5 senses and all the ways that you're currently connecting and interacting with your environment. Perhaps you're focused on your breathing. You hear your breath and the quiet breaths of those around you. Your body is taking in oxygen to sustain your life. This is possible because of trees and other plant life, our rooted relatives. who provide an important function to us in allowing us to live. Perhaps you're feeling the fabric of your pants or the uncomfortable cushion you're sitting on. Both likely contain natural fibers. The cotton in these fabrics comes from plants in other parts of the world that grew to be able to make the cloth that touches your body every day. This is what acknowledging the land feels like. Consciously taking time regularly and with intention to think about the gifts that the land provides and your responsibility to respect it in the ways that it respects you by giving you what you need. Feel free to open your eyes and return to this space with a renewed outlook. For many of us, the history of how Edmonton came to be is grounded in the fur trade. By the time that Europeans reached this part of the Northwest Territories, the Métis culture was established, and voyageurs were helping the newcomers navigate this terra nullius, or empty land. Then Fort Edmonton was built, inviting First Nations to make the trek here to participate in the new economy. This led to coal mines, industrialization, and the city we know today. For the last 200 years, this has been the founding story of our city. With the recent addition of land acknowledgements, our story has shifted a little bit. Now the narrative is more like Indigenous people were here for 10,000 years, yada, 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 the fur trade, Edmonton. Well, this is a step forward, but we're still missing the mark. What happened before colonization? What was the experience of Indigenous people when the newcomers arrived? And how have Indigenous people continued to contribute in ways to this place we now know as Edmonton? What information are we not telling to complete this story? Recent efforts have been made to learn more about the Indigenous experience in the territory surrounding what is currently known as the North Saskatchewan River. There have been archaeological digs unearthing signs of daily life for those outside the fort. There have been historical burial sites upset and Indigenous remains reinterred. Oral histories have been captured from Indigenous people about their past experiences. But how is all this information changing who we are as a city? I've made my home here in Edmonton for 20 years now. Before the settlers arrived, my people used to travel regularly through this territory from the east by way of the river. When I walk on the banks of the North Saskatchewan, I feel like I am following in their footsteps of my ancestors and hearing whispers of their existence before the Edmonton story begins. I close my eyes and I can picture people arriving by water and on foot from across Turtle Island to share in ceremony. These experiences are ingrained in my blood memory and influence my present-day ties to the city. Thousands of Indigenous people like me have these same ancestral connections to this place. We have been gifted with information about the importance of living in reciprocity with this land. We've been taught about the places where the river narrows and shallows, where people and animal used to cross the river with ease. We've been told of sacred ceremonial sites that have been in use for centuries, and the places where traditional medicines still grow today. This knowledge has always been here, passed down through the generations, but few outside the Indigenous community have ever cared to consider it. In this time of reconciliation, more settlers are beginning to recognize how their narrow understanding of our past has influenced their relationships with the land and with their neighbors. Colonization has not only taken from Indigenous people, it has taken away from settler society as well. Imagine if Indigenous land stewardship rather than ownership was the foundation for all urban development. Imagine if city planning worked in conjunction with migratory patterns of birds and mammals. Imagine if all of our decisions were made considering the impact for the next 7 generations to come. This doesn't mean that Edmonton wouldn't exist as an urban metropolis today. It would just look very different than it does. Indigenous knowledge is not a relic of the past, and there is still an opportunity to learn from elders and knowledge keepers, but it requires a concerted effort. The city is still finding ways to renew relationships with the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations and the Métis Nation of Alberta. Projects like Kichiaski and Inu River Lot 11 are shining examples of the forgotten histories and reclaiming place. More and more average citizens are finding and recognizing the gaps in their own knowledge. As a city of people from different backgrounds and experiences, we all need to do a better job of understanding one another. At the heart of it, reconciliation is about relationships. Relationships with one another and relationships to the land. To all two-legged, four-legged, winged, finned, rooted, and flowing relations. Through these relationships, we will gain knowledge, deepen our connections, and allow for other truths to resurface. I challenge you all to create space in your hearts and minds for old ways of knowing, to include Indigenous perspectives in your understanding of the world, and to learn about the knowledge that's hidden in plain sight. Land acknowledgements must be about our relationship to one another, to the land, and to the beings that are sustaining us through our existence and relationship with them. At the ultimate level, reconciliation is about aiming to rebalance these relationships. We have a responsibility to think about the work of reconciliation and living into that treaty relationship by considering what existed here before colonization and collectively making individual strives to return to that balance. Colonization has taught us to live and operate in particular ways, but we also have agency and responsibility to challenge those ways of knowing and being. Oftentimes I hear from folks that it's, I'm just one person, what can I do? Ultimately, it's the government's responsibility. I can't change laws, I can't change bylaws, I can't decide what gets built. Well, the great thing is we live in a democracy and we form government. So we elect individuals to represent our needs and make decisions as a collective. How often do you consider reconciliation in the treaty relationship when you sign the ballot at an election or choose a candidate to support? Another excuse that I hear is we are suffering from the traumas of the past that we had nothing to do with. I wasn't alive when residential schools happened. I didn't know that they were happening. Well, I challenge you to think about what is happening in present day. 100 years from now, what are your relatives that you will be an ancestor to going to look back on and say, I can't believe they let that happen? Things like the child welfare system. Indigenous people in Alberta make up about 5% of the population, but 79% of kids in care. What about access to safe drinking water? 90% of First Nations in Alberta have been under a boil water advisory in the last 10 years. What about the housing crisis on First Nations, where there are families, multi-generational families, 12, 15, 18, 25 people living in a household filled with mold, where they can't build their own home because they are waiting for the government to do that? What about the environmental racism, the impact that you have and society has on resource development that disproportionately impacts First Nations and remote communities? What about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 8 years later and the 94 calls to action that are waiting to be fulfilled? What about 4 years later after the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry and the 231 calls for justice that have yet to be answered? What about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that Canada fought to implement and is still not fulfilled? Those are present day issues that you are allowing to happen. You are perpetuating by silence, violence against Indigenous people and saying it's okay. A few years ago, the Walrus had an event at the conference center downtown, the Walrus Talks Aboriginal City. And Bob Rae, former premier from Ontario, gave a talk about treaties. And his analogy that's kind of stuck with me was, were treaties a marriage or a divorce? The Crown saw them as a divorce. Here are the terms we're agreeing to. You get this, I get this, and we never have to talk about it again. Whereas First Nations saw it as a marriage. You're bringing this, I'm bringing this, and this is how we can live together. So I ask you to consider that yourself. Are you living in a treaty marriage or a divorce? I want to leave you with a quote here from Anishinaabe storyteller Jan Sherman. She said, "Land acknowledgements are living entities formed by sacred breath that should be spoken from the heart and reflect humility, gratitude, respect, and a responsibility towards place, fire, water, and air. They should speak of our honest, traditional, accurate recognition of our kinship with the land. If you are a guest on the traditional lands of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis that have called it home for thousands of years, your acknowledgement should demonstrate respect and gratitude to these people for the way they lived and continue to live in nature." I'm going to leave you now with a part of a land acknowledgement that comes from the University of Guelph. This land is a product of many stories, seen and unseen. It is shaped by the wind and the water and the people that have flowed and continue to flow across it. It is one of many meeting grounds of Turtle Island. It has been the stage for many dramas that have been forgotten and many that are all too well remembered. But all of these dramas have played a part in building the life that we have today, with all of that privilege and all of its pain. Being honest and open about this history is central to land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are not meant to instill guilt or assert treaty rights. They are not lip service to institutional or government mandates, nor are they meant to simply convey sympathies or regret. They are a way for all of us to feel more connected to the land that sustains us. They are a reminder of our responsibilities to the land and our responsibility to the natural world. They are meant to push us to educate ourselves about the history that has shaped our lands and our lives so that we can continue to build relationships from this place of honesty. Land acknowledgements are meant to remind us that Canada was founded neither on pristine wilderness nor on empty space. Rather, it was built alongside and then on top of Indigenous nations that existed since time immemorial. And also, it reminds us that those nations continue to exist and continue to have responsibilities to the land and inherent rights to determine their own futures and practices and practice their own language and culture without discrimination or interference from other forms of government. Land acknowledgements highlight the importance that Indigenous people place on kinship with the land in a culturally responsible way. It's a step towards building a future focused on understanding, respect, reciprocity, and a reconnection with the land and with one another. Finally, the land acknowledgement is a platform for real change and real commitments to be put forward. It is meant to break the silence that has left Indigenous people and communities in Canada deprived of clean drinking water, disadvantaged of educational opportunities, forced into housing and poverty crisis, and de-established by systemic racism and inequality. For settlers and visitors, the land acknowledgement should inspire questions like, what steps will Western institutions and organizations take to mend the privilege gap, which began with colonization and continues in many of our present-day policies? How have you benefited from colonization at the expense of the cultures, lives, and livelihoods of Indigenous people? And what will your contributions to reconciliation be and a future focused on equity, reciprocity, and nation-to-nation relationships? With that, I want to turn the microphone over to the congregation here at Westwood, and I've asked them to ponder this question about their own next steps on this journey to reciprocity and truly acknowledging the land.
Well, thank you, Miranda, for informative, engaging and challenging expression of your truth to us this afternoon. I'll tell you of one commitment that Westwood is in the process of making, and I'm going to ask Brenda Jackson to come up and do that.
Hi. Hello, everyone. So this series was advertised as a three-part series, and this is the wrap-up of it. And we're ever so grateful to Miranda for being here as our last speaker. And Miranda also kind of helped us get started on this path when she came originally to do the first workshop. So this has been a continuing thing over a few years now. And our little group that works on organizing these things would like it to be a continuing thing. We recognize and acknowledge that our learning is not complete. There is much work to do. And so we've been talking, and we would like to continue in the fall. And we're looking together at some dates, and we're thinking about a Friday evening soup and bannock evening with perhaps an invited guest or some other activity yet to be determined that would help us in our growth and understanding as we work through these things. If I can get Hannah to put the slide up for me. Okay, thanks. So if you came here and you registered through the Eventbrite, that means we have some contact information for you. On our website, this is the front page of the Westwood website, and we do have this Truth and Reconciliation Resources page on there. And that is one way we try to encourage our congregation and the public in general to find some ways to follow the path and increase their learning. And we really appreciate anyone sending us input into anything they see there. If they find anything they feel is out of date, anything that should be updated, anything that should be added, we're trying to provide some resources to help people on their journey. So we always appreciate that. But more than that, if you have been coming to these things, or even if this is your first time here, we'd like to invite you to be part of our little group that plans these events and have your say in who should we invite to speak, or what kind of activity might we imagine having that would help us. So we are open to your inputs. You don't have to be a member of Westwood, you just have to be interested in working along on this path. We have been meeting over Zoom so that it's been easy for people. They haven't had to come out to a meeting. In the future, that might change. We might decide to get together in the actual physical space here for some reason or another. We also, as a small group, we try to keep each other aware of events like the Treaty Recognition Day and things like that, as does the website, so that we encourage passing the word around. So, so we have reconciliation@westwoodunitarian.ca. If you email that, you'll get to us, or web@westwoodunitarian.ca. I also get those messages for the website. So either of those things will help you connect with us. And when we do plan an event, we will, as people who have signed up for these events, we will send you a notice about that, just to let you know what's happening. So we hope that appeals to some of you and that you might join us on this journey.
So I'm hoping that there are questions percolating this afternoon, and if you have a question, if you would kindly come up and speak your question into the mic so that we can share it with the folks that are not here. We really appreciate it. And so over to questions.
Hi, Miranda. There's a term that I've heard more and more often lately, which is land back. And for the purposes of this workshop series, I would be really interested to know, in a perfectly reconciled world, what would land back look like to you?
So to me, land back would mean that the determination of what happens on the land is in the hands of the Indigenous people whose territory it's on. So right now there are layers of rules and regulations because of the orders of government that exist that determines what can happen, where, and who can benefit from the land in different ways. And if that was wiped clean and the First Nations and Métis people who were responsible, and Inuit people who were responsible for the land stewardship before colonization and before those rules were put in place, actually had the authority to determine what happens there. So that's a perfect world. I think in more reality, think about the steps to getting to that. Involving Indigenous people in those decisions is a step towards land back. I've seen examples of land transfers that have happened, private landowners that have returned the land to nations to be stewarded, but that doesn't take away the rules and regulations about what can happen there. There's still taxes to be paid. There's still, development permits needed, all of those things that still have those rules in place. So again, those are examples, but it's not to that utopia that I think we should be striving towards. Other questions? Are there any questions online? No?
Miranda, thanks for your talk. I guess a follow-up question to the answer that you just gave. Looking at moving beyond having land regulated, like, are there any tangible steps happening towards that, or how do you see that moving forward? Like, I think about, there are a lot of instances of places in, for example, the Beaver Hills biosphere where land is being, I would say, increasingly donated to organizations like Nature Conservancy Canada, Ducks Unlimited, organizations who sort of take stewardship of it, plant forests, there was a group 2 years ago that was planting, I think it was 100,000 trees in a couple of days, including things like Saskatoon, so that 20 years from now, people can just step over the fence, go and pick berries. But, so those are examples of stewardship by scattered organizations, working sometimes in concert. But how do you, is that a step towards that? And what paths forward can you envision?
So I have two thoughts based on that question. One is, you've probably heard rumors about an urban national park being created in the city of Edmonton. So we currently have a federal government that says it's committed to a nation-to-nation relationship. This will be the test of that in an urban environment where there are multiple levels of governments involved in creating a space that is intended to be for public use and public accessibility. So I challenge you to watch that process, get involved and advocate for this idea of land back as a foundation to that work. That will be the true test of it in multiple layers of governments at the table. The second thought I had was around this idea of what does it actually mean to steward the land? And we have organizations, specifically, as Dylan mentioned, not-for-profits, that are dipping their toe into this idea of responsible land stewardship and involving nations in that work, but are still their own colonial institutions. They still have their own rules and regulations that they follow. They have governance structures and bylaws that exist that allow or disallow certain things to happen. So yes, it's a step towards that, but it's still layers of regulation that are being imposed that you have to fit the box of. I would challenge you to think about this idea of land back within your own realm of responsibility. What is your own land ownership status? What does that look like? Who do you pay taxes to? Who benefits from your existence on the land that you occupy? And there becomes your own responsibility in this conversation. So there are steps that you can take. I want to point to the city of Victoria that has implemented an opportunity for people to double their municipal tax every year, and half of that go to the neighboring nations. So anyone can do that. It doesn't take a municipal government to mandate that. I also want to take it further back to, again, some of you raised your hands saying that you read Treaty 6. And the interpretation of Treaty 6 was seeding the land as deep as the plow. So 6 inches into the land is what was given in return for the signing of Treaty 6 and ceded to the Crown. Everything under 6 inches was never given up by nations. So if we think about that in present day terms, what does that mean for resource development? Who would be benefiting from the resources that are taken 6 inches under the ground and further? In oil-rich Alberta, I can tell you that has not been, First Nations have not financially benefited from that. And thinking back again, it doesn't mean that resource development would never happen. It means it would happen in a different way than how it's happened. I really don't believe we'd be dealing with the climate crisis we have today if we would have honored Treaty 6 in the way it was intended. And decisions about 6 inches underground and everything else would have been formulated by consensus by the nations who are responsible for stewarding their traditional territory. So again, thinking about your responsibility as a treaty person, what does that mean in how you vote, who you advocate for, who you teach others about the intent and the existence of Treaty 6 and what it actually means to live into that relationship. Hello.
I don't know if any First Nations have made claims on Blatchford. It would be good if that didn't get developed colonially. And my second question is, do reserves actually have mineral rights underneath them, or does nobody have mineral rights in Alberta?
The short answer to your second question is it depends. Many nations have gone through different negotiations with the federal government to access mineral rights and share those in different ways. Others don't have the capacity to negotiate that, and it's been not upheld. So that's the short answer. Related to Blatchford, I think it's interesting that, so the center of the city, a pretty big chunk of land that's undeveloped. Lots of promises have been made in the last 10 years about what that development's going to look like. And slowly it's inching towards housing actually existing. But I think about, the city of Edmonton and the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations have an MOU, as they do with Enoch Cree Nation. And those two entities have not been fighting for land back necessarily within the city limits. And so I defer to them as rights-based organizations to determine what's best for them. But I would say specifically for me and my work around the Camsell Hospital, the history of Blatchford is not being told in a truthful way. And I think that's more important. So Blatchford Fields, the former municipal airport, was a wartime airport is how it was built, but it also was the main reason that the Camsell Hospital was built where it was because of access to the airport, and flying patients in without their consent or authority to be treated in Edmonton from the north. So the history of the Kamsel Hospital, specifically in the treatment of tuberculosis for Inuit and northern communities, is based in Blatchford Field, and no one tells that story. The patients that traveled there unwillingly without consent and never returned home. No one talks about those stories. No one talks about the federal government, even when patients were released from the hospital, they were never given a return ticket home. And many of them died on the streets of Edmonton because they didn't have the supports that they needed. And I'm supporting families going through flight records for airlines that don't exist anymore that flew patients down to locate information about them. And we want to celebrate this aviation history of Edmonton, but we don't want to talk about the nasty side of it. And if we want to talk about the truth, it has to be all parts of the truth, not just the ones that we want to celebrate that perpetuate this idea of colonization as a good thing. Okay, we've got someone on Zoom. Sure.
Hi, this is Angela. My question is about urban reserves. Has there been any conversations or dialogues about, there's so many Indigenous people living in the urban center like Edmonton. I don't know if it would, how it would be, if it would be beneficial or what needs to happen to have them have a place of their own, or what we can do to help them feel like they belong in here.
Sure. So I think belonging and urban reserves are two different things, so I'm going to talk about them differently. So urban reserves are a new tool that First Nations have to access, to purchase or be gifted land in urban centers, to claim that as part of their reserve, their land entitlement under treaty. So currently Edmonton doesn't have an urban reserve, but I know that there's negotiations amongst many nations that are seeking that opportunity. There are urban reserves in many communities across Canada. Saskatoon, Winnipeg, Regina, all have urban reserves. So that is a process and a tool that's available. Again, that has rules and regulations. It's not a free turnover of land to do as you like. It still has to be regulated under provincial, municipal, and federal laws. And so it's lots of strings attached is the short answer. The question of belonging, though, is different for me because in urban centers, Indigenous people can be made to feel like they belong through many different tools like placemaking, like the creation of cultural centers and organizations that provide services unique to the community. It can be in the architecture, in the landscape, in the naming. All of those can create belonging. And ultimately, belonging comes from social inclusion. And so there are tools that can lead us to social inclusion, but ultimately, individually, we are responsible for making our neighbors feel like they belong. Urban centers have been a challenge because of colonization, that Edmonton, because of where it's situated geographically and the services that are available here, has become a magnet for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Canada, especially from the north, because it is the largest, closest urban center. So even though this is the traditional territory of Treaty 6 and the nations that belong here, this is home to many different Indigenous people, and we need to figure out ways to balance the rights holders and the people whose territory this is, and the guests who have made their home here for now generations, and making sure that everyone feels like they belong and feel welcome in this space.
Well, Miranda, on that tall order, I think that it's time for us to get up, stretch, continue the conversations, among ourselves as long as you want to be here to connect or to introduce yourself or to talk. We'll be here as well. And we would like, if you have found this session worthwhile, kindly consider donating to defray the costs that we have taken on in the blue box as you go out the door. We'd welcome a donation. Today has been another rewarding one for the group of Westwood to be joined by you as curious explorers of our surrounds, and for some of you, folks with deep knowledge of this place. You've come for the presentation. Please refresh yourselves and stay for conversations, and we do hope to see some of you again in the fall. Thank you for being here.
Before we end, I just want to acknowledge Sara, if you can stay up at the microphone for a second. In my tradition, there's something called a blanket ceremony, and elders or knowledge keepers or community leaders blanket those in the community who need to be recognized for their work and their commitment. And so I want to provide a blanket to Sara today.
No words.